We have a terrific doubleheader for you today. Not just one great mystery writer, but two, each at the top of her game, as their new books show. Both came to their craft somewhat serendipitously. Louise Penny, who of course is Canadian, started out as a journalist and radio host for the Canadian Broadcast Company, and only began writing fiction later, coming out with her first novel when she was in her 40s. Anne, who is British, became a novelist while living with her husband, an ornithologist, on a tiny island nature reserve. They were the only two residents. Her husband was the warden there, but Anne herself wasn't into birds, so she started writing. Both have gone on to become among the most accomplished mystery writers of our time, with lots and lots of honors confirming as much. They've each developed series with compelling main characters whose ongoing adventures leave us eagerly awaiting next installments. Louise's Glass Houses is the 13th in the series, featuring Inspector Armand Gamache, who first appeared 13 years ago. The novel opens with Gamache in a courtroom, testifying in a murder trial and describing the arrival of a dark hooded figure in Three Pines, the remote Canadian village where Gamache and his wife have a home. From there, the story spins far beyond the courtroom into quite an elaborate plot that does justice to the enduring magic of the whole series. And The Glass Room is the 5th in the series, featuring Police Inspector Vera Stanhope. It gets underway with one of Vera's hippie young neighbors, Joanna, going missing. Vera tracks her to the writer's house, a local retreat for aspiring authors. Inhabitants there have already called the police after discovering a grisly murder, and Joanna, found with a knife in her hand, is a prime suspect. But the investigation grows quickly complex, so complex that Vera begins to suspect that the killer is taking murders from fiction and making them real. Now, Anne and Louise are friends, so I suspect the discussion between them will flow quite freely. They'll be in conversation here today with Taylor Burney, a freelance journalist and writer who spent a number of years with WAMU as a radio producer and events manager. An avid reader and passionate literacy advocate, Taylor has a weekly newsletter called Get Lit, DC, that highlights literary events in the region. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Anne, Louise, and Taylor.
Hello, everyone. It is always such a joy to be in a room full of readers, especially when it's a room this big. Hi. And I just want to briefly thank Brad and the entire team at Politics and Prose. I love working with them. And I've often said that the store is not in the neighborhood where I live, but it is very much a part of my community as a reader. And I'm so grateful, as I imagine all of you are, to have this kind of community here in the district. We're very fortunate in that way. And I'm so excited and fortunate to be up here with these two for a conversation this evening. I have lots of questions that I'm dying to ask them, but in pretty short order, we'll turn it over to you all for your questions as well. There's a microphone right here. So in a few minutes, I'll give you the heads up that we're getting ready to head towards your questions. So think about what you might want to ask. Please do make sure it's a question, and then we'll give you the heads up to queue up here. But without further ado, Louise, Anne, welcome to DC.
Thank you. Thank you, Taylor. Fabulous to be here.
Thank you.
Anne, I think this is your first visit, is it?
It is. It's my first visit here, so it's lovely to be here. I am, as you can tell, British.
Well, you've brought the lovely weather, thank goodness.
That must be a first, someone saying that Britain brought the nice weather.
Yes. We'll take it however we can get it, so thank you for that. We're so excited to have you here, and you've going to be talking about these glass novels as we've been talking about them. But I wonder, it's number 13 for you, Louise. It's number 5 of 8 for you. When you first wrote these characters, did you expect to spend this much time with them?
I certainly didn't. I had a very new young editor when I started writing the Vera books, and she told me that crime fiction was dead, that she was commissioning no more mystery series. She thought that people didn't want them anymore, so please would I write a big standalone psychological novel. So I started out with this book that was about 3 women who were living out in the wilds in Northumberland, which is where I live, and they would be doing an environmental survey, and one of them would die. But it wasn't going to have a detective in it. It wasn't going to be a police procedural. And about a third of the way through, I got very stuck. And I think it was Chandler who said, if you're stuck with a plot, have a guy burst through a door with a gun. I don't do guns, as I explained, I'm British. So I decided I would have a door burst open and I would just see who came in. And I was writing a funeral scene, so you imagine the door at the back bursts open and we're just about to start the first hymn, and in walked Vera Stanhope. And she walked in, it's one of these magical, I don't know if it's ever happened to you, one of these magical moments when something just happens, and she walked in, she was fully formed. I knew her name. I described her as looking more like a bag lady than a detective. And that's where she came from. Luckily, my editor married a music journalist and moved to Australia.
We were just in a convention called Malice Domestic in Bethesda, not far from here, and one of the guests, Anne, brought over Brenda Blethyn, who plays Vera in the series. And Brenda told the funniest story about getting the call from her agent to say that there's this new series, it features an older woman, would you be interested? And Brenda said, yes, she'd been thinking about retiring, so she thought, yes, maybe I might as well go out and see what it is. So she started reading the book, the first book. And she said, it can't be a very big role, because it was like 3/4 of the way through a third of the way through the book before Vera shows up. And then Vera's described as this drunken bag lady. And she said, I think I'm perfect for the role.
But she is, isn't she? She is.
She's
totally
remarkable.
So
remarkable.
How did Gamache turn up?
I had wanted
you?
to write for forever, and I thought I would probably write the best book ever written.
Of course,
because otherwise why bother? And I promptly suffered 5 years of writer's block because that was paralyzing. And then a number of things had to happen, which I won't go into right now, of how I finally did get to write. But my desire was really to hold one book that I hadn't made out of cardboard myself, that had my name on it, that was actually published, to see it in the bookcase, with spine out, Louise Penny. And when the first book came out, and actually I had written it, I was overjoyed. And I hoped that it would become a series, but never expected that it actually would. I never expected it would be published. I wanted it to be published, but I had no expectation it would be. As I said, I just wanted the one book. And then my agent, I still remember the day my agent called to say, and she's British, so I apologize in advance for what I'm about to say, and maybe it's...
No, I know her.
Yes, you know her. And it might also be the colonial in me, but every time I hear someone speak with a British accent, there is an implied "you idiot" that I hear. So Teresa, Mad Teresa, called up and she said, Louise, I have sold 3 books. I won't bother, obviously, doing the British accent. I've sold 3 books. And I said, my God, Teresa, that's fantastic. Mine and who else's? She said, Louise, you idiot. They're all yours.
She would have said, you idiot.
She would have actually said it. It's not implied after all. I'm actually hearing it. So that was it became, I wanted it to become a series, but I'll tell you, it was terrifying to actually be handed a series and then have to write it.
There is always the writing to do,
There is the
which we'll
writing.
talk a little bit more about later. But you two have known each other for quite some time. How did you first meet, and how has the experience of sort of going through this process, been for each of you, and how have you benefited from knowing someone who's going through a similar process at the same time?
We met in a crime convention in the UK called Crime Fest in Bristol. And I'd been writing for much longer than Louise, but without any success at all. So my first 20 years of being published, nobody had heard of me. I sold just enough to get above the accountant's line, just to keep. But I never got advances. I'd write the book, and then I wrote a book called Raven Black, which is the first of the Shetland books, which won the Gold Dagger and made a huge difference to me. At about that time, Louise was writing Still Life, so we bumped into each other because Still Life just went stratospheric very quickly, and so we bumped into each other at conventions at around that time, didn't we?
We were on a panel together too, I think, and
we were,
and we bonded over, unlike Taylor, over a moderator who.
Oh no!
Well, it's hard to describe. How would you describe?
He wanted us to write stuff before the convention,
like an entire book. He wanted us each to write a chapter or something. It was a kind of an insane request.
And I'm quite nervous and don't know how to say no to people, possibly because I'd had 20 years of being rejected as a writer. And Louise sent this very polite but very firm reply saying, "No way, Jose." And I loved her from that moment.
And then we just got along. We just hit it off. And I was reflecting this weekend, being surrounded by other crime writers, that I thought the reward was having a book published, because it had been something I had dreamt of, and it didn't happen for me until I was well into my 40s. So it was just, I was overjoyed to have the book. But I thought that was the prize. And it turns out that the prize are the friendships that I've made, including this really very important friendship with Anne that goes beyond the books, as of course friendships do. And then we had one of the things that I remember most clearly was the lunch we had together in London. This was, about 6, 7? The way I can date it is that Vera, the pilot, had just been made.
So that would have been 8 years ago.
That was 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Everything is in my mind a couple of years ago. Yeah. So that was 8 years. And the pilot, tell them about that. The pilot had just come out.
Yeah, and we weren't very sure about whether it was going to do very well or whether anybody would like it. And so it was that nervous point of just wondering whether a series would be commissioned.
And of course, most don't do well, do they? I mean, that's just the reality of it. There, I don't know, 100 pilots for every 5 series that's picked up.
Yeah, so I was just incredibly lucky because it was so well done, and the person, you need a champion, I think, within the production company who absolutely understands your work before they adapt it. And my champion was a woman called Elaine Collins, who insisted on the shows being filmed where they were set. And a lot of that is about what comes over, I think, in the shows. So understanding the books, and in both our books, I think, and we'll ask Louise to talk about this in a bit, I think the characters grow out of the place that they are. Mm-hmm. And some new writers, I think of landscape or a setting as just being a pretty backdrop or an interesting backdrop. It's not, because people grow out of the communities where they live. And so in both our books, setting influences character, but also it influences plot.
I'm actually really curious about that, and you beautifully teed this up. Do you think of your settings as a character unto themselves to some extent? Because they are so incredible. I mean, it's important in any novel, but I think in both of your work, it's crucial and just so important and elemental, and really has created this community and atmosphere that is such an integral part of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll answer it for yourself, but it's clear that you feel the same way. That yes, as you've just said, the setting is character. Setting is a character. My books, it was obvious to me right from the get-go that I wanted there to be no doubt that my books are set in Canada. And I think in each of the books, within the first line or two, there is some reference to Quebec or the Sûreté de Québec or something, or Canadian, something, so that they are firmly rooted. And it gives me such joy, because they are, among other things, probably least among them is that they're about death. They are love letters to my friends, to my family, to where I live, to the place where I found home. They're love letters to home and to belonging and to friendship in general. And that, as Anne said, it springs from the soil, from where I found a home. There's a line that I think I've used in at least one of the books, and I can't remember where it comes from. Someone else's. It's not mine originally, but that history is geography spread over time. And I believe that. And the character's history is a function of the geography that they live in. And so what a joy to be able to reflect that geography to all sorts of people. And not just the geography, but the sense, the cuisine, the climate. For the first 4 books, I wanted each of my first 4 books to be set in a different season, because I wanted a sense of, if you read them in order, what it's like to live through a whole year in Quebec, and not just what it feels like to step outside and feel the sun on your face, or smell the fresh mowed lawn, or to feel the cold, but everything else that goes with it, the smells, the tastes. And I think that also, to make the books sensuous, you want to engage all the senses and bring down that fourth wall.
You just mentioned food, and I get hungry, real hungry, every time I read one of your books, because Gabri and they're just constantly turning out delicious foods, and I really want a croissant.
Yeah, you just want to live next door to them so you can pop in for coffee.
I do,
Don't you?
and I've had friends say, who've also read the series, that Three Pines is the most murdery, delightful place that they want to go visit.
Do you notice that there's not a vegetable in sight? Yeah.
And Vera talks about food as well. I mean, it's a lot more straightforward, but I do wonder, I mean, as Vera is, right? So I wonder why it was important to each of you to include those details, because I feel like you read some novels and no one ever eats or sleeps.
I think it's the small details that bring a scene and a book to life, because you don't want to generalize. You can't describe in general what makes a scene spring to life is the small details. So I can remember in one book just somebody baking scones and talking about how if you put scones close together on a baking tray, they won't spread. And that detail, I think, said a lot about the woman, the character as a cook, but it also said something about her precision and the way that she wanted things to be perfect, and the way that she could do it standing on her head because she'd done it so often. So it's all about showing, not telling, I think, that in just that one sentence you can say an awful lot about a character and about how she lives her life.
And Louise, you just mentioned the murders are somewhat secondary, but they're there.
Well, thank God.
Yes,
really.
There is the thing, the elemental sort of crux, and this is something I mentioned to both of you just before coming out. One thing I'm very curious about as a reader of crime fiction, which comes first, the murder or some other key element of the plot? And I wonder this from both of you.
You go first, then I can think about it.
Well, I think you already know the answer. Definitely the other. The themes come first for me. The murder, while key, is secondary and less important, and used as a kind of a vehicle to amplify the other themes. I'm about to start the next book. I'm beginning to write it on Wednesday. And I have a notebook with me, and it's filled full of character ideas, theme ideas, perhaps some scenes, some conversational exchanges, quotes that I use, couplets from poetry. But I know who dies, but I don't know how they did it. I know who did it. I know why. But the how isn't as important. Now, to be honest, early on it was. And this is how my series has kind of evolved. The first few, you notice that?
I'm super curious about that because the first few murders in your novels are complicated.
They are.
And I remember thinking, was she at a local library and was the librarian wondering what in the world is this woman up to? Because, what kind of research went into those and how has that shifted for you?
Well, initially I was and still very much love the Golden Age crime novels. And I think I was kind of impressed by the Christie-esque, the closed door, closed room, how did the person die? It was quite complex. But as the series got on and the characters grew, and I think my confidence grew, that became less important and became less of an issue. They're still very proudly and obviously crime novels and murder mysteries, but the how did the person die is much less important and interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's the same with me too, except I really don't plan much at all before I start writing. I'll have thought about people, I think, and there might be some subject that I want to explore in the book because I'm not quite sure about it myself, and by writing through it I find out a bit more what I think about it. But I write like a reader, so I'll start with a scene and I'll write the first scene, and then I need to know what's going to happen next, so I write the next scene. So I probably don't know who my victim is, never mind about who my murderer is, when I start writing the book. It's very, very organic.
If I ask a question, how many drafts do you do then?
A lot, and I'll rewrite as I'm going. But I think people ask what the secret is to being a good writer, and I think you read a lot, and the more you read, the more you have a sense of what builds a story and what shapes a good story. And I think, and sometimes I'll read one. I read Glass Houses a little while ago, so I can't. But I read it thinking, this structure is so clever. She's not going to get away with this.
Yeah, exactly. I remember you saying, "Oh, this isn't going to work."
And then she pulls it off.
This is from a friend, right?
She pulls it off so well and so cleverly at the end. And that must have been plotted and planned because it is so intricate and the structure is so strong.
I'm the same way as you are. When I do think things through beforehand, I have an idea of the overall theme. I knew it was going to be about conscience and stuff, and I knew it was going to start in a courtroom and go back and forth, but that was about it. The pacing, the structure, that really came in the second, third, and fourth drafts. By the time I finished the first draft, I think we're the same. Only then do I really know what the book's about, and then I can go back and simplify and work on issues like pacing and clarify structural things that haven't worked.
So speaking of the new novels, or new novel for you, new in paperback for you, can you give us the sort of dust jacket overview for those who've not had a chance to read them yet about the new?
Yeah, the Glass Room is set in a kind of writer's retreat. It's the writer's house, and it's where wannabe writers go. And there's a short stories course going, a crime short stories course is being run there. Called Shortcuts. Brenda gets home one night and finds that she has hippie neighbors who run a small holding, and the woman has disappeared, and the guy wants to find out what's happened to her, and it seems that she's been awarded a place in the writer's house, and Vera goes along to find her, and of course there's been a murder. So it is quite golden age, this one, and it is quite literary, because some of the clues have literary clues in them. Some of the murders are set up to look like the stories that are being written. But I had such fun sending Vera unpretentious to this rather pompous writer's retreat. I had such fun writing it.
I wonder.
It's an amazing book. It's a great book. It's a great book, and very fun, but very thoughtful. I mean, it's as your books are.
Well, and I wondered about that reading it, because I was sitting there thinking, okay, writers, and I wondered if you had any hesitation at sending her into that atmosphere, or if it was just fun.
It was just fun, and it came about, we talk about, and sometimes books come about for the most prosaic reasons. So this book was started because by this time, I think, one series of Vera had been on the television, and I'd got to know the lead script writer very, very well, a guy called Paul Ruttman. And he said, I really want to include Vera's hippie neighbors, but they say they haven't got a budget for them. Can you write a book that puts them right at the heart of the novel? And it's the one book that has never been adapted for television. So.
That's right. I remember reading that. They found it too difficult. The structure or something was too hard.
Just too much about words and books, and I think that's true. I think it would be really hard to turn it into good TV, right. And too much inside. And they love showing those great wide exteriors of Northumberland.
Right. Glass. I think it's so fun that we're both glass something.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you conspired, but then I realized the timing was
slightly. Well, she's always following me.
I think you'll realize that I wrote it first. My book came first.
Prove it. Mine was out first here.
Out here.
Now the truth comes out about we're like sisters, right? She's the older one.
Don't make me turn this church around.
Don't make me come down there. A new mother. You can tell she's a new mother. She's practicing. She can practice on us. Don't make me come over there. Now, what was the question?
I think we need a different question.
Oh, my book. We're here to talk about my book. We're here to talk about my book. Glass. It's kind of a little bit similar to what you were saying, in that because I write a series, I'm always interested. Well, I'm keenly aware of not writing the same book over and over again. You know, no one I know does it on purpose, but sometimes you can do it by mistake. You back into it. And I sure don't want to do it, and Anne absolutely doesn't do that. So what I try to do is think about putting Gamache and the others in different situations. And I realized that through the series so far, we had seen him and them up to the arrest, but not what happens after that. So I thought it could be so interesting to see Armand Gamache, the head of the Sûreté de Quebec, on the witness stand. And so it opens with him giving testimony in the murder trial. We don't, intentionally, I don't let anyone know who has been arrested because we go back and forth, obviously, to when the crime was committed to the trial. But I thought it would be also interesting to see what would happen if he's being cross-examined, except he's being cross-examined in a very aggressive way by the prosecutor, who should be on his side, but he's really going after Gamache, and Gamache is giving as good as he's getting. And why are these two people adversarial? And the judge is wondering, like, what is happening here? And so that was interesting. But at its core, it's about conscience. It's about the role that a conscience plays in our lives. And on the surface, superficially, it would appear that a conscience, well, it's clearly a good thing to have. I mean, there's a saying that the only people who sleep well at night are those with a clear conscience or none at all. And so, you know, we do think that a conscience is a good thing to have, but how many vile acts have been committed in the name of conscience? How many people have been lynched? How many abortion clinics bombed? How many people violated in the name of a conscience? And so, and this, you know, there's, as I get older, what the line between right and wrong, it's not quite so clear. There's an ambivalence, there's a gray zone there. And so
I think that's what we both do, is explore that grey zone, because neither of us write monsters. We write ordinary people who do wicked things sometimes, or are put under so much pressure. But I have never written somebody that I couldn't see through their eyes, see the world through their eyes, or step inside their shoes. And I think we both do that.
That's exactly right. And in both of our books, good people do bad things and bad people do good things. And that's the nature of humanity.
Absolutely. There's so much gray area. And in this novel in particular, you're talking about the opioid crisis as well. And that's sort of at the center of a lot of what Gamache and his team are wrestling with. Why was it important to you to take on that very real and very devastating issue in this novel?
Well, I think like most families, addiction has been an issue in my life and in my family as well. And it just seems that, the joke's over. And in it, Gamache talks about the fact that the war on drugs has been lost. And he's not a pessimist, as you know. He is an optimistic man who believes that good will prevail, but he's also a realist, and he says we have to change what it is we're doing if we have any hope at all. And that's where the conscience comes in, where he's clearly struggling with the question of whether he should do something that most people think is unconscionable in order to win the war on drugs, or at least have a chance to win a battle.
You both just mentioned something that I wonder about as well in terms of the characters, and that, there's no one in your novels that is either wholly good or wholly evil. And I wonder if there is a particular trait that you think is important for a victim to have, or for the person perpetrating the crime to have, to make them perhaps sympathetic to readers, or, a little more understandable, especially when you're talking about perhaps, someone doing something that is clearly unconscionable and that many would see as either black or white.
I think I'm interested in why people do things. I don't think there's any trait that you would, but I think it's a bit like a kind of psychological archaeology, that you're digging back into the past to digging under the superficial, back into the past to find out why people do things. And I think that's something that Louise does. So I'm quite interested in families and how they work and digging under that, because it seems to me that through the generations we either react against our parents, or we choose to be more like our parents. And I'm quite interested in how that works.
And I think both of our books also deal with contrast and duality between the public face and the inner thoughts, that gap between what we say and what we feel, between the beauty of the countryside that we talk about and the hideous acts that are hidden there.
Absolutely. And speaking of the public face and sort of the inner workings, one thing I'm always very interested to talk to authors about is the work of writing, which is a very solitary thing, and then the work of being an author and coming out and talking to so many people, and the demands of touring and keeping up social media, and and we were talking a little bit beforehand. I know you've come up with a kit for libraries in the UK, actually based on the Glass Room, and I wonder how that has helped maybe alleviate some of that pressure and just how you manage all of the demands.
Yeah, the kits came about because I'm a passionate advocate for libraries, but also independent bookstores. And I kept being invited to go and speak to library reading groups and to reading groups in bookstores. And I found it so hard to say no. So I thought I would devise this pack so that people could run events without my being there. So they're like murder mystery packs. They're fun. And they're set around, I've done a couple set around the novels, but you can you can do it if you want to do it for your book group, or if you're a friend of a library. They're free. You can download them from the website, the publisher's website, and just have fun with them. But it did allow me, with a clear conscience, we're back to conscience, to say no to quite a lot of invitations to go and speak to libraries. I could point them towards the pack instead.
And I wonder the same for you. I mean, you have a robust website, and I wonder how your relationship with readers has informed your work over the course of these 13 novels.
Well, I'm very aware of I mean, both Anne and I feel, we're very engaged with the readers, and very aware of, we wouldn't be sitting up here if it wasn't for all of you and the gratitude. And Anne and I talk about it all the time. When I first started touring, I mean, I counted how many people were there, and it came to 0. Sometimes my husband would be there. Sometimes one other person, which was the worst, right?
Yeah, because you can't cancel then.
No, you have to go about it. They'd be sitting right where you're sitting, right there, right? Doesn't realize she's alone until that moment of horror when she looks around, and then she's trapped. And we both wish she would just drop dead.
And sometimes you think that somebody's... I did one once where we were there and kept hearing footsteps. I think, there people are coming, more footsteps. It turned out there was a line dancing class in the next room, and they were all going to that.
So to sit here in front of 450 people is just, it's joyous for both of us. And so, and the same sort of thing in terms of the emails that we get and Facebook and being really engaged with people. Because what a wonderful world we live in, that again, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? There's the danger of the social media, but also all the gifts that come with it.
Absolutely. And speaking of this, there's something, Louise, that you've done that I think your American readers may not know about. There's a Gamache novella that is not necessarily part of the series, but that ties into it. Can you tell us a little bit about The Hangman and sort of the literacy effort it supports? Because, as you mentioned, there's 450 people here tonight who can read your novels and enjoy them, but adult literacy doesn't necessarily get as much attention.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for literacy, and I'm the honorary, thank heaven, president, which means I don't really have to do much except show up every now and then, of the local literacy association. And I was approached by the overall literacy association in Canada to write a novella, and among other Canadian writers, I wasn't the only one, that is aimed at emerging readers, adult readers, because obviously emerging adult readers don't want to read children's books, and that's essentially what was available to them. So they wanted adult books with adult themes, adult language, but written at a grade 2 or 3 level, which is actually quite difficult.
Yeah, I've done one too. We have a similar scheme called Quick Reads.
That's right.
And it's brilliant because it makes you think about what is the real essence of the story. If you've only got 15 or 20,000 words to tell it in, and you have to keep the sentences simple, it's really
And yet the
great.
thought's complex.
Yeah, it's a really great writing experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last question from me. So if y'all want to start queuing up, now is the time, and don't be shy because time goes by quickly. But one thing I always wonder about, again, as a reader of crime fiction, how important is it for each of you that your reader be able to solve the crime? Because I got to be honest, I usually don't.
I'm a great lover of the cheap thrill of the surprise ending. And man, did you do it in Glass Houses?
I would love people to be able to solve the crime, but clearly I don't want you to be able to solve the crime. But I know that some people reread the books, and if you do, I would love people to say, "Oh no, how did I miss this?" or "How did I miss that?" It's the what's known as the fair play novel, where you could get it if you tried. I mean, Agatha Christie was kind of famous for both fair play, but also the opposite, where in more than one novel, in the waning 20 pages, some stranger would suddenly show up at the door and have the final clue or be the murderer. So you could never work it out.
Ma'am, microphone's yours.
You're alone in the room.
I wish. Thank you very much, all of you, for this event. I recently read, or started reading, I haven't finished. It's 4 crime novelists, and I can't think of any of their names, but they've written individual novellas collected into a book, and they think of it as episodes in the way that a TV series would have episodes, and then maybe the next season will come in the next book. And these 4 authors, maybe it'll be 4 different authors. And it sort of got me thinking of the spin-offs that we see when we have our favorite series and then Cheers has a spin-off, you know. And I was just thinking, have either of you ever thought of taking one of those characters like someone's wife or someone's daughter or whatever and developing another? I mean, I love your series, but I'm just wondering, have you ever thought of doing something that wasn't within, now you've done different series, but you've just got the one, am I correct? Have you ever thought of doing something like a spin-off?
No.
Okay. Think about it.
No,
I'm wondering if you get feedback from readers saying, oh, I love so-and-so, and I'm wondering what's happening.
Weren't Peter and Clara going to be the detectives?
They
to
were.
start
Peter
with?
and Clara were initially, Anna's quite right, Peter and Clara were initially going to be the main characters, like a Nick and Nora Charles sort of thing. And then, sort of like you and Vera, not unlike you and Vera, Gamache opened the door when a young agent knocked on it, and he appeared so fully formed that I realized he was the center that could not, that would not fall. So no. Some people ask every now and then about Ruth and whether Ruth could investigate. Good, she and the duck. She's fine, which would be fine. I would call it I'm fine. Have you thought of spinning off?
No, I don't think so. Not a spin-off, though. I was a bit worried because I was chatting to Brenda over the weekend, and she was saying, "Well, I wonder what they'll do when I leave. Do you think they'll have the sidekick Kenny, Aidan, carry on without me?" I said, "You're not going to retire yet, are you, Bren?" Well, I think I've got another couple of series in me.
But you know, but they do on TV. I don't know if it would work so well in books, but of course, there's Lewis. There's a spin-off from Morse. There's Endeavour, which took him earlier on. So I'm fulfilled enough doing what I do.
A comment and a question. Question first, I guess. Do you write Ruth's poetry?
No, I don't write Ruth's poetry.
I have never followed up to find that out.
That's Margaret Atwood for the most part.
Okay. Do you give her anything for it?
Oh yeah, no, I do it with permission because as a Canadian, you are legally not allowed to piss off Margaret Atwood.
And the comment is that I found you with your first book. I wrote you an email. At the time, you responded within a couple of hours. I was so touched by that, and the fact that what I had to say about why I loved your characters, probably in the first and second, was their humanity. And I said at the time that as a psychologist, as a clinician, I was very touched by your understanding that people's complexity really allows reprehensible things in spite of one's desire to be whole and human. And you complimented me in return by saying you were touched by my understanding that. And I very much appreciate that we had the time to have even another exchange before things really began to come in. But I love what I've read, and I thank you for keeping your people complex and human.
Hi. I'm a great fan of both of yours, and Louise, I started with you with your very first one and have just gone down the line. I also appreciate your blog, or your monthly newsletter. I don't know, Anne, if you have one, but if
What
you don't...
do you have, Anne? You've got Twitter, right?
I do Twitter more just because it's very short and snappy, but then I belong to a group of English writers called the Murder Squad, and we do have a newsletter that goes out.
Oh, that's too bad, because I'm too old for Twitter. It's enough I do Facebook.
But you can subscribe to the newsletter, go through your website, right?
Just go through my website,
Yeah.
and I'll put you on the newsletter list.
Great. So my question is, I was very interested to hear that you're married to an ornithologist, because actually I discovered you through the Shetland Island series. I had no idea that you were also Vera. And I feel that Vera has somewhat taken over here. So I'm here to speak for the Shetland Island series, which, I mean, if we talk about landscape, the landscape in the Shetland Island series can't compare to the ones in the Vera series. I mean, the landscape there is just, it's alive. It really is, it's more than a
Shetland is a spectacular place, and I first went there more than 40 years ago, and I did live in the island of Fair Isle for a little while, so
right,
I do know it very well.
So my question is, first of all, I hope you write more in that series and that you don't let Vera overwhelm you. And the second thing is, could you say something more about, because those are so full of birds, and I just am very interested to hear you say something about that series, what it means to you, just whatever.
Yeah, the Shetland series probably means more to me than the Vera one, because as I say, I dropped out of university. I went and worked in the Bird Observatory in Fair Isle, just because I needed a job. I knew nothing about birds when I was there, and I was cooking, and I couldn't cook either, but when you're 19, that doesn't really matter much, I don't think. And I met my husband there, because he came as a visiting ornithologist. And I was back in Fair Isle a month ago, and I flew in on one of the little 6-seater planes to go, and because my husband died just before Christmas, so it was a return visit to go and recover my roots and go and say goodbye to some friends there. So
Thank
it
you.
means a lot.
Okay, maybe we'll see more of them. Thank you.
There will be one more Shetland book called Wildfire, and that comes out in September.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Well, I'm so happy to hear both of you. I, too, am a huge fan of Shetland. My question right now is for Louise, and that is, where in the process of writing your books did you decide on Gamache's backstory that would arc through all the books? That is the part that leaves me breathless.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I think it really kicked in. I knew that there was obviously a backstory that I wanted to, and the beauty of writing a series is that it's like meeting friends for the first time at a cocktail party, and you're drawn to them, and then you get to know them better and better as you go through life together. So I didn't feel the need in the first book to reveal all. It was really in the fourth book, I think, that I realized that I wanted to talk more about the loss of his family, the fact he was raised by a Holocaust survivor, what that has done to him in terms of his sense of family and belonging and decency.
And his troubles within the Sûreté.
Yes, and the corruption within the Sûreté.
And that just grew as you wrote the series, or did you have that fleshed out in your mind early?
No, that sort of evolved. The corruption within the Sûreté evolved. I didn't realize that it would. In the very first book, I described that Gamache's career had stalled, and the editor said, "Well, I think you have to explain why it stalled." Well, I had no idea why it had stalled. I don't know. You throw these things in. And so I said it was because of the Arnaud case, but I didn't know what the Arnaud case was. And then, and then somewhere along the lines, I thought, let's figure that out. What was the Arnaud case? And that then came to fruition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may jump back in real quick, that's so funny to me because a friend and I were reading the first together and then sort of lost each other. But we just kept saying, Arnaud, what is this Arnaud situation about? What's going to happen with this? But the other thing that raises that I'm curious about that you do in these novels is you foreshadow a lot as well.
Right.
And I wonder if that was, again, sort of if that was an intentional piece from the start, or if that's something that has sort of taken on more momentum in the course of writing the series, because I think it is always so beautiful, and it started right from that very first novel, to have these sort of glimpses at what is to come for these characters, for better and worse.
I think probably for both of us, there's a bit of both. Some of it is intentional. There is a lot where I'm just sort of spreading the seeds and things that I may go back to later. I'm a bit like a chipmunk in winter, or a squirrel in winter, and I squirrel some ideas all through the books, and 3 or 4 books later, I might say, you know what, now's the time to go back and pick that nugget.
And Vera's father serves that purpose.
Yes, Vera's father, the dreadful Hector, runs through the series, and I don't know if there's the new hardback out, is called The Seagull, and in that book we do learn a lot more about Vera and her childhood and her father. So that's very, it is that psychological archaeology again, isn't it? It's going back and looking at what makes people who they are.
I am so honored to be in the presence of these amazing writers. I have a comment and a question for Louise. The comment is, everybody talks about the food, but for me, the most delectable part of your books is the delicious writing. It's just so amazing.
I love you.
The question is, what part of you came up with Ruth? And how did you manage to make such an unlikable character so endearing?
Ruth, for those who don't know, is a sort of a drunken, slightly mad poet in the village. She served a couple of purposes. She was quite early on, she came in. I've known a couple of Ruths. Like, one wouldn't be enough. I've actually known a couple. Not poets, though. And what I wanted to do was, I knew I was in danger of having too many decent people. And I needed a kind of a Greek chorus for the village, and that's what Ruth did. Ruth was kind of, I talked about the veneer, the veneer of civility that, thank God, we all have, and we keep our more rancid thoughts inside, really, or most of us do. Yeah, not everybody does. But most people do. Ruth was born inside out. She keeps her civility and her kindness inside, and the rancid thoughts come out. She has no filter. But I wanted her, like all of us, everyone has a saving grace. And hers is a certain, in fact, quite keen sense of self-awareness in the world around her, and that comes out in her poetry. So her poetry is her grace.
Thank you so much.
Hello. Hello. I have a question for each of you, if that's okay. I think you just said, Anne, that you're starting to explain. It always bothers me what happened so terribly to Vera that she's so shut down she can't even have a friend.
See, I don't see her quite like that. I see her as just enjoying her independence and wanting to be alone. And and her friends and her family are her team, I think.
Well, she's not very nice to them.
She's all right to them. Vera would hate to be patronized, and so she refuses to patronize other people. So her team might want, and the new management style might be to give people pats on the back and tell them how well they're doing. And Vera knows that she would hate that, and so she won't do it to other people. She does have friends in the books. I think it's a bit different in the TV show. In the book, she does have her neighbours who she goes and has tea with, and they stock her freezer and look after her and dig her out if she gets snowed in. But
which kind of dignifies her to her team that she has friends.
Yeah, right? Maybe. I think Vera doesn't care about what people think of her. And I think that's why I like writing about her, because I probably care too much what people think about me, and I'm too sensitive about that. So it's quite nice to write about this woman who really doesn't care.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm just wondering how Gamache, with all he sees and goes through, maintains his humanity and his kindness?
How after he's been through, because his I just want to make sure I understand the question.
The murders and
that's murder and this cruelty is his world,
Mm-hmm.
and yet he is a kind man. That actually came about because of my husband. He's sort of inspired by my husband, who was the head of hematology at the Montreal Children's Hospital, which is like the worst job you could ever have. And he would sit with dying children through the night. But when he came home, he was the happiest man on earth. And not because these terrible events made him happy, but because he understood what a gift life is.
Yes.
And that's what Gamache understands too, that he understands that the world is a terrible, terrible place, but he also absolutely believes, as I do, that goodness exists and will prevail.
I suspected that. And sorry for the loss of both of your husbands.
So I haven't read your books yet, Anne, but that's the beauty of Politics and Prose book talks. I'm now going to go buy the first one.
Thank you very much.
I had a question, Louise, about whether or not your books would come to life on the small or the large screen. It'd be very fun to figure out who all the characters would be. I'm thinking Kenneth Branagh might be terrific for Gamache. Just wondering if you had any...
As long as he didn't wear the moustache.
No mustache, no mustache. Just wondering if you had any plans in that direction.
Well, if I thought they could be brought to life half as well as Anne's have been brought to life, I would have no problem with it. The first one was to no great effect. In fact, it was quite awful. But I don't want to, I mean, I say that, but I try not to, I try not to criticize it too much because I don't want the actors to feel like I'm criticizing them. It certainly was not their fault. So I'm to be honest now, I failed to protect the characters the first time around, and I don't want to make that mistake again. So I'm very leery.
I'm a huge fan of both. I think I've read everything so far. But with Louise, I get lost in the descriptions of your paintings. I'm still, years after reading it, I'm still haunted by how the light gets in and those descriptions. I would love to see those paintings. Do you have an art background?
You do.
I do. Do you have an art background? Do you know any painters? Like, how do you get those visuals? Do you picture the painting first?
The fact is, I have absolutely no art background at all. Michael was an amateur and very gifted amateur artist and loved painting, but painting was not part of the conversation when I was growing up. Literature was, but not painting. But if you go back and read those sections, in fact, I'm not really describing, you do, I'm not really describing the painting. I do in sort of broad strokes. What I describe are people's emotional reactions to the paintings, and that I understand. The paintings I don't understand. Although I admire.
Yeah. Did that come, how the light gets into that, what came first? The Leonard Cohen, did you find that connection first, or did you paint?
No, the painting came first. I think the Leonard Cohen quote came as I was writing, and it just seemed appropriate.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And our last question.
She took my first question, so I only have one for you, though I'm very honored to get to talk to both of you. Louise, what has it been like to be an Anglophone writer writing about Francophone Canadians?
That's an interesting question. I was born and raised in Toronto, so I'm an Anglo. I was unilingual English, but I had searched for home for most of my life, and I unexpectedly found it in Quebec. And so I write about the Quebec that I know. I was a journalist for many years. So I got to travel, I got to see the politics. It's got what one of our great writers called the two solitudes of the Anglo and the Francophone. It's interesting to live and work in a community where everybody feels like a minority. There's a certain sort of worldview that comes with that. I was a little afraid of how the Francophone majority would feel about my books when they were translated into French. But they've embraced them, and I'm deeply grateful.
Well, you write with great love for them. I can see why they would embrace them. Thank you.
How about with Shetland? Were you at all worried about how the people of Shetland would view?
Yeah, I started writing Shetland after I'd lived there for a while, so that I did feel that, like you, that I was an outsider writing about a place that I didn't know quite well. And I talked to somebody there, and he said, just go for it and we'll help you. And they did. They have done. So.
But now people are traveling there because of the series, and how's the island sort of responding to that?
I think the island used to have lots of money because oil came in there, and now the oil isn't there anymore. They're very happy to take tourists' money instead.
But it's been life-changing, hasn't it, for Shetland? Because Shetland now has this international adoration.
Yeah, I think so. But Shetlanders have always had outsiders coming in because it was seamen, or it was whalers, or it was oilmen. So they're just very rooted and very sensible people, and I love them very much.
Well, and to that point, I wonder. I mean, I think that some writers write what they know, and I've heard others say they write what they want to know. And I think it's sort of a marriage of those two, and it's something that I appreciate as a reader because I feel like I've learned about these places in a way that makes them more real than maybe reading nonfiction about them to some extent. Is that something that you've, again, aimed to do in that work, is to introduce people to these places and these dynamics within the culture?
Now, I tell stories, and I think we've talked a lot about what lies behind the stories, but if you write fiction, you're helping people to see the world through other people's eyes, and that must be a good thing, because what we need at the moment is more tolerance and more understanding. And fiction can do that in a way that non-fiction can't.
Well, here. I think that's a beautiful place to leave it, and I know you all are going to sign some books for these lovely folks. And thank you both so much for spending time with us.
Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. And thank you, Taylor, and thank you, Politics and Prose.